Hey everyone, welcome back. If your application uses Cosmos DB and you are planning your DR strategy, there are a few things that you need to know more than just adding a secondary region. You need the account setup, of course, using your IAC tool. You need the SDK configured correctly in your application. And you also need to understand what are the DR options that you have for this service. Today, I'm covering all of it: account setup, SDK configuration, and I'm going to show you two valid DR approaches for this case. So let's get into it. Before we configure anything, you need to understand how Cosmos DB decides where to serve your reads. When you create a Cosmos DB account, by default you will get a global endpoint and regional endpoints. However, when you are connecting to the Cosmos DB account, you will be using the global endpoint in your connection string, not the regional ones. And then Cosmos DB service and the SDK will decide how to route that traffic to the proper region. That is why I decided to explain this DR strategy in 3 layers: the network path, the SDK routing, and the actual account state. For the network path, what you need to make sure that you have is that when we create a geo-replication and it is using private endpoints, you will need to make sure that the private endpoint exists in the primary region and also in the secondary region. And also making sure that both can connect to each other. The second part is the SDK routing, and this will affect the reads of the application. Think about it when you do a failover for the application, but Cosmos DB stays in primary. However, you want to connect from the DR application to the DR read instance. So this will help you to do so, because if you don't specify this, by default, the reads also will go to the right region. And finally, this is the actual account state. Is when you decide to do a failover for the Cosmos DB account, or maybe Azure did that because it detected a region outage, or you did a forced failover. The account state will change the right region. So as you can see, it's not only one step. There is a set of steps that you need to do when you are planning to do this DR strategy. The question now is, what happens once you are inside the service? Let's take an example where the application was failover to the DR, but the Cosmos DB stays in primary. If you don't set up anything in your SDK configuration, this will be the behavior. Your application stays in DR, it will connect to the service using the local private endpoint, but once it reaches the service, it will route the read to the primary region, which is in this case the same as the right region. This can be fixed using the ApplicationPreferredRegions parameter in the .NET SDK. If you specify this from the DR application and you say, I want that my preferred region in this case is the East US, now all the reads will be handled by the East US replica and the writes will be going to the primary one. Before we write any code or Bicep, I think that you need this mental model regarding how Cosmos DB works with the write and read regions. In a standard multi-region Cosmos DB setup, you have one write region and one or more read regions. The write region is the only one that accepts write operation, as the name suggests. All writes, regardless of the client or where they are located, goes to the write region. And then Cosmos DB takes that data and replicates to the other read regions. Reads are different, and it's because you can change the behavior from the SDK, whichever the region you choose as preferred. So let's say that this application was moved to East US because we did the failover. And in the code, we specified that our preferred region was East US. So for this application, the SDK will send all the reads to the East US replica, which is read only, but the writes are still going to be cross region because there is only one write region. Here's one more thing. Moving your application to the secondary region does absolutely nothing to the Cosmos DB write region. Cosmos DB doesn't know that your application was moved. The write region stays in the primary region until you explicitly change it. But then you may ask, how does the write region change? There are 3 ways that it changes. The first one is called the service managed failover, and it's basically managed by Azure. When Azure detects that there is a regional outage, it promotes the next region automatically. The catch with this is that it may take 1 hour or more per official documentation. The second one is called forced failover, which basically is triggered by yourself. This completes in seconds, and this is what you should be using in your DR drills or in a real outage, rather than using the service managed one. And the last one is called change write region, which basically is a planned swap when both regions are healthy. This helps when there is a migration or you want to improve latency if your application is in the other region. There is one more thing that catches people after a DR test. When the original write region comes back online after a forced failover or a service managed failover, it does not automatically becomes the right region. It comes as a read region. You have to manually promote it back as the right region. Now let's build the Cosmos DB configuration using Bicep. This is a very simplified version of the normal production architecture. This is not using private endpoints and so on. but you get the idea of the read and write regions. Here in this array, we define our locations. We have the primary region and it's defined as the failover priority 0, which means it will be the write region. And the remaining ones, in this case only one, are the read regions. These are the regions that will be promoted once the primary region has an outage. In the Cosmos account resource, we have few options. The first is the consistency. In a moment I will explain more in detail this one. We are setting at a session, but we pass the locations, and we have two things. We enable automatic failover, which is telling Azure to handle also the promotion of the regions if they detect that the primary one has an outage. Again, as I mentioned before, this can take some time, so I encourage you to do that manually. And then also we are disabling multiple write locations. I mean, I said before that you only have one write region, but actually you can have more than one. It's just like the setup and the consistency and the conflicts are gonna be very difficult. Something I forgot to mention is that we have some redundant in the locations. This will mean that the replicas will be spread across different availability zones within the same region, and this can mitigate any outage inside a region. So if there is a data center issue, the replica will be in another data center inside that region. Now let's take a look at how the Cosmos DB client looks like in most of code bases. You define this client and you don't specify any preferred regions. Hopefully you pass the global endpoint in your connection string and not the regional one. But with this setup, both reads and writes will be handled by the write region. If your requirement is that, that's fine. But if you want that the DR application uses the DR replica as preferred, then you need to specify that. And the way to do so is with the application preferred regions option. So you define your options and then you define the list with the locations. So this one is going to use East-US, which is the DR region, as preferred for reads, and the primary region or write region as the fallback. And when you instantiate the client, you pass the endpoint, the credential, and the options. The last improvement that we can do to our code is that Cosmos client is a singleton. It manages connection pools, it manages the failover routing. So creating it per request will break all of that. For that reason, we should register it once, and that's what this code is actually doing. It registered it in a singleton so that we make sure it is created it only once. Now that we have the account configured, the SDK set up properly, I'm gonna show you two valid DR approaches. The option one, it's gonna be if we fail the application over to the DR region and Cosmos DB stays in the primary region. And the second option is a full DR, where both the application and Cosmos DB goes to the DR region. For the option one, since we already set up the SDK properly, we have our preferred region to be East-US. When the app moves to the East-US, the reads will be local because it will be pointing to East-US. However, writes are gonna still cross region to the primary region because we left Cosmos DB there. Before relying on this option, you may need to make sure that there is a network path between the DR environment and the primary environment. And of course, the latency between the DR and the primary is under a threshold that you can manage. For option B, we fail everything to the DR, the application, and also we force the failover for Cosmos DB. So everything, reads and writes, will be local to East-US region. This option will give you full regional independence since there is no cross-region dependency for writes. And this is what it's recommended when you have long outages or when you want to test a complete regional isolation. Before you run the DR drill, you need to know what consistency level your Cosmos DB account is, because it will affect directly what you will find once you do the failover to the DR region and whether data loss is acceptable or not. Cosmos DB has 5 consistency levels. From the strongest to the weakest, we have strong, bounded staleness, session, consistency prefix, and eventual. Session is the default and the most widely used. For DR, the metric that matters is RPO, which stands for Recovery Point Objective, which basically means how much data can you lose if we do a failover. A strong consistency gives you 0 data loss. That's why the RPO is 0. And the reason for that is because every write is committed synchronously across all regions before it is acknowledged. In a session consistent, which is likely what you are running, writes replicate asynchronously to other regions. The RPO, according to Azure, is less than 15 minutes, and usually it's much less. However, in your DR test, you should account for it. Here's the complete picture of what we just saw. Cosmos DB has a global endpoint and region-specific endpoints. Each endpoint has its own private IP. The global endpoint always routes to the right region from anywhere, no matter where your application is. If you don't specify the preferred regions, the SDK only uses the global endpoint, which it's pointing to the right region, to also route your reads. The Bicep gives you the account configuration, multi-region, failover priorities, and automatic failover. The SDK gives you the ability to set up local reads, from your DR application. And the DR option that you choose will depend on the outage scenario that you have and whether you need a complete regional independence. Test the network path first if you are going to choose the option A, validate that you have the SDK configured properly, and put some fail-bad steps in your runbook. Subscribe for more content like this. See you in the next one. Bye bye.